The morning her brother handed her the keys, Wren Calloway was still wearing the dress she had worn to her mother's funeral. It was a Tuesday in early November, and the sky over Pittsburgh had gone the color of old pewter. The kind of cold that didn't announce itself, but simply arrived and stayed settling into the bricks and the mortar and the spaces between things. She had slept 3 hours the night before, maybe four, and her eyes felt like they had been filled with something that wasn't quite sand and wasn't quite ash, but was somewhere between the two. She had eaten half a piece of toast that morning because Dot from next door had put it in her hand and looked at her in a way that made refusing feel like cruelty. The kitchen table was where it happened. The same table where she had done homework for 12 years, where her mother had rolled pie dough on Sunday afternoons with the radio going low, where they had eaten 10,000 ordinary breakfasts without ever knowing they were the best mornings of their lives. Breckett sat at one end of it. Hadley sat at the other, studying the grain of the wood with the focused attention of a man who needed somewhere to look that wasn't his sister's face. And Breckett had the folders. They were labeled. That was the thing Wren would remember long after she had forgotten the exact words he used. The folders were labeled in a neat hand, tabbed and organized, the kind of paperwork a person prepared in advance over time with intention. She registered this detail the way you register something important in a dream, not understanding it yet, filing it away in the part of the mind that keeps things until you're ready. Breckett was 34 and built like their father had been, broad through the shoulders, with a face that could be warm when he needed it to be, and something else entirely when he didn't. He ran some kind of business back in Columbus, the particulars of which seemed to shift depending on who was asking, and he wore clothes that fit him the way expensive things do, with a kind of casual authority, as though good fabric were simply his natural state. He spoke gently. That was the thing. He spoke with the softness of a man who has rehearsed his gentleness, who knows exactly when to lower his voice and when to let silence do the work. He told her the news the way you tell someone their car has been totaled with regret, with a kind of practiced sorrow, as though the facts themselves were a burden he was heroically bearing on her behalf. The medical bills, he said, were substantial. The treatments, the in-home care, the last 4 months of equipment and specialists, and things that hadn't worked, all of it had added up to a number that the insurance hadn't come close to covering. He slid a page across the table toward her, dense with figures she didn't try to read because her mother was 9 days in the ground, and reading numbers felt like something that belonged to a different version of herself, a future version who had figured out how to breathe again. The house would have to go, he said. It was the only way to clear the debt without it following all of them around for years. He said all of them with the careful inclusiveness of a man making a shared sacrifice feel like a shared decision. And the bakery, Wren said. Breckett paused. His face did the thing where it softened on purpose. The bakery, he said, was more of a problem than an asset. 2 years sitting dark and locked, property taxes, unpaid, a lien on the building from some repair work their mother had apparently financed and never cleared. Code violations going back. He shook his head with the rueful gravity of a man delivering unwelcome truths. If they tried to sell it, he said they'd probably have to pay someone to take it off their hands. So here was what he proposed. He and Hadley would take the house, take the accounts, handle the debt, absorb the headache, shield her from all of it. And the bakery, the building that was already in her name, free and clear, she could keep that. Something of their mother's. Something with her name on it. He smiled then. Be practical, Wren. The shine's all spent. What's left is a cold room and a tax bill, and we're giving you the only thing nobody can fight you over. She signed where he pointed. Page after page, her signature getting smaller each time, the pen heavier, the act of forming her own name growing more foreign with each iteration, as though she were signing on behalf of someone she barely knew. She signed away the house she had grown up in. She signed away whatever remained in the accounts. And she signed her name onto the deed of a dead bakery on the corner of 2 tired streets, and Breckett slid the heavy key ring across the table to her with the air of a man completing a fair transaction. For one moment, sitting in that kitchen with her dead mother's keys in her hand, she had felt almost lucky. She had the bakery, she had her mother's ovens, and her mother's name above the door. And that had to be worth something. That had to be worth more than money. Hadley hugged her when they left. He held on a half-second too long, and when she pulled back, his eyes were wet, and he wouldn't look at her directly, and she had thought at the time that it was grief. She had thought that for a while after. The new owners of the house were polite and a little impatient, the careful courtesy of people who want a space emptied. "You can have until Friday," the woman in the nice coat had said. "After that, we start the renovation." So Wren had until Friday, and it was Friday, and she had nowhere to put herself for the night. She had not planned to go to the bakery. Her feet simply brought her the way feet do when the body knows something the mind hasn't finished deciding. 11 blocks from the bus stop through the early dark, past the shuttered shoe repair, past the laundromat where the dryers ran all night, filling the sidewalk with warm exhaust that smelled like other people's lives, past the brick fronts of the Allegheny neighborhood she had known since before she could name it. The bakery sat on the corner where two streets intersected with the tired familiarity of a place that had always been there. The big front window had gone gray with dust. The sign above the door maze was still there, still gold, though the letters had begun to peel at the edges in the way that paint peels when it has given itself completely to a surface and the surface is slowly letting go. Wren stood on the sidewalk and looked at it and felt nothing she could name, which frightened her more than crying would have. Then she heard the click of nails on concrete and a sound that was low and hopeful, and she turned. He came around the side of the building the way he always had, low to the ground and careful. A dark red dog with a graying muzzle and one ear that had healed wrong after some old injury, giving him the permanent expression of a creature paying close attention. The neighborhood had always half-owned him. Her mother had named him Rue for his color and fed him every morning at the back door a heel of yesterday's bread and whatever the day had left, before she unlocked the front for the first customers. Wren had assumed he was long gone. Dogs like that didn't last, and no one had filled the back step bowl in 2 winters. But here he was, thinner, slower. His eyes had gone a little milky at the edges. He walked straight to her and leaned his whole weight against her shins, the way he had always done with her mother, with the uncomplicated trust of an animal that has decided you are safe. She whispered something she hadn't planned to say, something about him waiting, about the door. He thumped his tail once against the brick wall. She tried the keys on the back door, working through them in the cold until one turned. The door gave with a sound like something long held releasing, and the smell came out to meet her. And that was the thing that finally broke her open. Cold flour and old sugar, and a sweetness baked so deep into the walls over 30 years that 2 winters of locked doors and empty cold hadn't been able to kill it. For 1 second, it was every good morning she had ever had. For the next, it was a room that would never be the same thing again. She let the dog in behind her and closed the door against the November wind. The back room was exactly as her mother had left it on the last day she'd been well enough to stand at a counter. The 2 large mixing bowls upside down on the drying rack. The long wooden work table scarred white from decades of use. The walk-in cooler standing open and unplugged, its door slightly ajar, dark and dry inside. And against the far wall, the brick oven, the one her mother had loved with a fervor that seemed disproportionate and made complete sense once you had watched her work it. Its iron mouth was cold and black. Wren set her duffel bag on the work table. She found the light switch from memory, and a single bulb buzzed to life, yellow and uncertain. The power hadn't been cut. Something in her mother's careful arrangements was still paying that bill, though Wren wouldn't understand why for some time. She had no blankets. She found the clean proofing cloths on the linen shelf, the ones her mother had draped over rising dough, and she made a place for herself in the corner nearest the brick oven, where the walls still held the ghost of warmth from every fire that had ever burned inside it. Rue circled 3 times and settled against her with a sigh that seemed to come up from somewhere very deep. And she put her hand on his ribs and felt them rise and fall, and was grateful in a way she couldn't have articulated that she was not alone in this dark. She counted her money in her head. $51. She didn't count it with her hands because doing it that way would have made it more real than she could afford for it to be. The 200 bracket had pressed into her palm at the door, had gone to the bus, to a few days of groceries she had carried with her, and eaten standing up in the house she was no longer allowed to sleep in, to the practical small purchases of a person arranging the logistics of their own displacement. After that, she made herself stop thinking about the money. She matched her breathing to the dog's slow rhythm and listened to the old buildings settle around her in the cold, the tick and creak of a structure accommodating the temperature, and she waited for morning with her eyes closed. Sometime past 2, she gave up and got up, careful Rue, waking with her and following. She walked the front room in her socks, the display cases empty and clean, wiped down by her mother on the last day, as though she were simply closing for the night and would be back in the morning. The brass bell was still over the front door. Wren touched it with one finger and didn't let it ring. On the shelf behind the register, the shelf where her mother kept the things that mattered, she found it. A battered tin box, rectangular, painted by hand with a single yellow pear on the lid, the paint worn soft at the edges from years of floury fingers. The recipe box. Wren had watched her mother open this tin 10,000 times and had never once been permitted to look inside. When you're ready, her mother used to say, and tap the lid with one finger and put it back on the shelf. Wren carried it to the work table and sat on the stool and opened it under the buzzing light. The cards were there, dozens of them soft at the corners from a lifetime of handling. Her mother's careful printing on every one. Sweet bread, morning rolls, the custard tarts that sold out before 8 most days. Wren lifted them out in stacks and her eyes blurred and she had to set them down. Underneath the cards, flat against the bottom of the tin, was an envelope. It was sealed. The paper had yellowed at the edges the way paper does when it has been waiting a long time. On the front, in her mother's handwriting, in ink that had gone soft in brown Wren. She picked it up with both hands. It weighed almost nothing, and it weighed more than the house. Rue put his chin on her knee and watched her face. She turned it over once, pressed her thumb to the corner of the flap, and then she set it back against the tin. Not tonight. Not with her mother 9 days in the ground and her own name signed away across town and the cold coming up through the floor into the bones of her feet. Whatever her mother had needed to say badly enough to hide it under everything else and wait, Wren was not ready to hear it yet. She looked at the envelope for a long time in the yellow light. Then she made herself go back to her corner and lie down, and eventually somewhere before dawn, she slept. She woke to gray light in the dirty window and the sound of knocking. 3 knocks, then a pause, then 2, the pattern of a person who knew the door and expected to be recognized. Rue lifted his head, and his tail moved once, the slow, confident wag of a dog greeting someone he trusted rather than feared. Wren slid the bolt and opened the back door. A small woman stood on the step in a quilted coat, the dark purple of old irises, holding a covered dish in both hands. She was somewhere in her early 70s with iron-gray hair pinned up and a face that had been shaped by decades into something that looked less like age and more like weather, the quality of a person who has been outside in all of it and is still standing. The moment she saw Wren, her eyes filled. "Dorothea Fenwick," she said. "Dot. Next door, the flower shop. I held you when you were 4 days old. You won't remember." She did not wait to be invited. She stepped past Wren into the coal back room and set the dish on the work table and looked around at the dead ovens and the upside-down bowls and the single buzzing bulb, and her chin trembled once before she pressed it flat. 2 winters, she said quietly, almost to herself. That door was locked for 2 winters. I used to bring my coffee out to my back step in the mornings out of habit. Just habit. And there was nothing. No smell. You don't know how loud nothing is until you've had bread on a corner your whole life, and then one morning you don't. She turned from the oven and looked at Wren. "Sit down," she said. "You look like you haven't eaten since the reception, and I made too much soup last night the way I always do because there's nobody at my table to eat it. Sit." Wren sat because she didn't have the energy to argue, and because the smell coming from under the foil was chicken and something herbed, and it reached into her chest and pulled at something she hadn't known was that hungry. The soup was warm and dense and tasted like a kind of care that doesn't announce itself. She ate 2 full bowls while Dot sat across from her with her hands folded on the table and said nothing until the spoon went down. Then Dot said, "Tell me why May's daughter is sleeping on the floor of a closed bakery with a stray dog when she's got two brothers with resources? So Ren told her, haltingly at first, then more completely the way a story comes out when someone is patient enough to receive all of it without rushing. The illness, the months at the hospital, the brothers arriving for the funeral and not before. Beckett with his labeled folders in his gentle voice. The debt, the house, the page covered in numbers she hadn't tried to read. The key ring slid across the table. When she got to the part about the lien and the code violations, and being told the bakery was a money pit, she'd have to pay someone to take, Dot's mouth went thin and white at the corners. The debt, Dot said. He told me the medical bills were enormous, that the insurance barely covered anything. And this building? What exactly did he say about this building? Ren repeated it. The lien, the back taxes, the violations. He said it was the one thing nobody could fight her over. He said he was protecting her by letting her keep it. Dot was quiet for a moment. Then she said carefully the way you set something down when you're not certain of the surface. Your mother owned this building outright, free and clear. She paid off the last of it the better part of a decade ago. I remember the exact afternoon because she brought a bottle of port to my shop, the good kind she only opened for things that mattered, and we sat in the back and drank it at 4 o'clock like a pair of women with nothing better to do, which was not true of either of us. And she cried happy tears. She said, Dot, it's done all of it. It's mine. Nobody can ever put me out of my own door. Ren set her spoon down very carefully. There's no mortgage on this building, Dot said. There was never a lien. Where would a lien come from on a building she owned clean? The room had gone very quiet. Ren could hear the furnace somewhere deep in the walls running its cycle and the sound of a truck somewhere on the street and Rue breathing slowly in the corner. Maybe the taxes, Ren said. She hadn't been paying them. 2 years closed. Dot looked at her steadily. Your mother kept every piece of paper she ever signed. She kept receipts from the 80s. It'll be in the office in the green folders. Go and look. Then you'll know what you're sleeping on top of. The office was a closet of a room off the back, barely large enough for the desk, and the filing cabinet smelling of dust and old toner, and the faint particular ghost of her mother's handwriting. She pulled the chain on the light and opened the filing cabinet. The green folders were there, alphabetical, every year of a careful life kept in order. She found the one marked the building and carried it to the work table and opened it. The deed was on top in a plastic sleeve. Harriet May Calloway, sole owner. Below it, a single bank document stamped in faded red ink satisfaction of mortgage dated nearly a decade back. Below that, the repair records, every fix itemized and dated and receipted, no outstanding work, no unpaid contractors, nothing that could have generated a lien on anything. And near the back of the folder, clipped together with a binder clip, 2 property tax statements. The 2 years the shop had sat dark and no one had paid. Ren added the numbers twice to be certain she hadn't misread. $920. Total. He lied, she said. The words came out flat because the rest of her hadn't caught up yet. There's no lien. There are no violations. It's $920, and he made it sound like a sinkhole that was going to swallow everything I touched. He didn't dump a problem on me. He gave me the one thing that was actually worth something, and he made me thank him for it. Maybe he didn't know, Dot said, though she didn't say it with any conviction. He had the folders, Ren said. He sat in my mother's kitchen with these exact numbers in front of him and told me the opposite of what they say. The anger arrived then, low and electric, the pressure that builds before weather. But what surfaced under it, what she felt first in that moment, sitting in her dead mother's chair holding proof of her brother's lie, was something almost like wonder. She looked around at the green folders standing in their careful rows, at the deed in its protective sleeve, at the brick oven, through the doorway, cold and waiting, that her mother had paid off with a bottle of good port and a cry on an ordinary afternoon. They thought they left me the joke, she said quietly. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Dot reached across the table and took her hand and held it hard. Your brothers robbed you, she said. We can call it that at this table. I'm too old to dress it up nicely. She paused. But your mother was not a careless woman. Everything she did on purpose. You hold on to that. Wren didn't fully understand what the old woman meant yet. She would. But that morning she only nodded and looked toward the front of the shop where the empty cases caught the gray November light, and she felt the first pull of a question she hadn't let herself ask until right now. What if she stayed? The thought was outrageous. She was 19 years old and had $51 and a tin full of recipes and nowhere to sleep that wasn't the floor. She had no idea how to run a business. She had failed to light the small deck oven twice already, and the brick oven in the back looked at her with its cold iron mouth, like something that required understanding she hadn't earned. But the ovens were right there, and the recipes were right there, and her hands, the ones everyone kept telling her were her mother's hands, were already restless in a way that grief alone couldn't explain. Dot left around 9 to open her flower shop, promising to return at noon. While she was gone, Wren went through the recipe cards one at a time. She knew them. That was what undid her a little, the knowing. She read the sweetbread card and her hands moved through the steps on the surface of the work table. The scald of the milk, the bloom of the yeast, the long, slow knead until the dough went silky and alive under your palms. Her mother's pencil notes were in the margins. More sugar in November. Let it proof near the warm wall, not the window. It knows when you're rushing it. Stop. She tried the deck oven. She knelt in front of it with a long match and turned the gas and waited, and got nothing but a soft hiss and a smell that made her back away quickly and crack the front door to the cold. She tried 4 times. Her hands started to shake, and it wasn't about the oven anymore. It was about everything at once. The house, the money, the 9 days, the folders, the $920 that her brother had looked at and called a disaster. One small mechanical failure standing in for every larger thing that had gone wrong. She sat down on the floor of the front room with her back against the cold display case and put her face in her hands and let herself cry. Properly this time, not the controlled grief of a funeral, not the numb, dry-eyed shock of the signing table, but the real kind, loud and ugly and complete. Rue pushed his head under her arm and stayed there until it was finished. It didn't take as long as she expected. When it was over, she felt scraped clean in a way that was almost useful. When Dot returned at noon, she took one look at the long match on the floor and the cold oven and made a sound in her throat. You don't light maize ovens with prayer and a stick, she said. That deck oven is old and it has opinions. And the brick oven in the back that is not a machine. That one is something else entirely. Somebody has to show you. There's nobody to show me, Wren said. There is one person, Dot said, and she was already pulling out her phone. Clement Pruitt had run May's brick oven for the better part of 20 years before his knees made standing, for long stretches, a negotiation rather than a given. He lived 4 blocks over with his daughter and son-in-law and 2 grandchildren who were loud in the way that children are loud when they are very well loved. He was 68 years old and had a face like weathered oak and white stubble on his jaw, and a cane he leaned on with the resigned irritation of a man who considered it a personal affront. Dot called him, and Wren could hear from across the room that he was pretending to be put out the elaborate theatrical reluctance of a person who had already decided to come before the asking was finished. He arrived 20 minutes later, slow and careful on the back step, his cane on the concrete, and then his foot, and then his cane again, a measured rhythm. Rue's head came up and his tail began to move before the shape appeared at the door. Clement came in out of the cold one careful step at a time and did not look at Wren first. He looked past her at the brick oven against the back wall, and his face did something that a person who didn't know him might have missed, a tightening, and then a release, a kind of grief that was also a kind of recognition. Filthy, he said. She never let a speck sit in the oven mouth overnight. She'd be ashamed. Hello to you too, Clement, Dot said pleasantly. He grunted. Then he turned his eyes to Wren and looked at her steady and without performance. You're the small one, he said. The one who used to sit on the flour sacks and steal the corner off every fresh loaf before it cooled. May let you get away with it. She'd have run anyone else off. He leaned forward on the cane, peering at her hands where they rested on the work table. You've got her hands. Everyone keeps saying that, Wren said. Because it's true, he said. And because hands are the only thing that don't lie about a person. Everything else a person can fake, not the hands. He shuffled to the brick oven and laid one spotted hand flat against the cold surface, gently the way you greet something that has been waiting and doesn't know if you're coming back. "So what do you want from me?" he said. Dot wouldn't say on the phone, just said, "Come, May's girl is home and she needs you." Knew I couldn't say no to that sentence. Wren opened her mouth and found the answer already formed. "I want to open it again," she said. "I don't know how to run a bakery. I can't light the small oven. I have her recipes and I have her ovens, and I have nowhere else to go, and I think I want to try." The room was quiet. Dot had gone still by the door. Rue watched from his corner. "You think you want to," Clement said, "or you want to." "I want to." He studied her for another long moment. Then he set his cane against the work table and he rolled up one sleeve and then the other slow like a man preparing for an argument. He has every intention of winning. "Then we don't talk about it," he said. "Talking is for people who aren't going to do the thing. We clean this oven today. Tomorrow I show you the fire. It takes most of a day to bring her up to temperature, and you do not rush her. You understand me? You do not rush her. She will crack, and then she is no good to anybody. Your mother burned 3 batches learning that, and she had a temper worse than mine." He almost smiled. "Now get me a bucket and the stiff brush, not the soft one. We are not painting." They cleaned the oven that first day. Wren did most of the reaching because Clement's knees made crouching a thing of the past, and Clement did all of the directing from a stool pointing with 2 fingers at every spot she missed. By the time the light through the window went dark, her arms ached from wrist to shoulder, and her nails were black, and she felt better than she had felt since the cemetery. Not fixed, not unbroken, but better in the specific way that physical work makes you better when everything else is beyond your control. The body doing what it can, the hands finding use, the hours passing with something to show for them. Clement left in the early evening with his cane and his coat, not saying goodbye exactly, just saying 7 tomorrow and pulling the back door shut behind him. Wren sat at the work table in the yellow light with Rue against her foot and the oven clean and dark beside her, and the recipe box and the sealed envelope side by side on the shelf where she had put them for the night. She was not ready for the letter yet. She knew this the same way she knew when dough was or wasn't ready by touch, by some quality in the air around the thing. Whatever her mother had needed to say was waiting and would keep waiting until the time for it arrived. She banked what small warmth she had left, made her nest of proofing cloths in the corner near the oven's stored heat, and lay down with the dog warm against her side. Above them, the old building ticked and settled in the November cold. Outside, the 2 streets crossed in the dark the way they always had. Somewhere past the laundromat, the dryers were still running, filling the air with the warm exhaust of other people's evenings. The brass bell above the front door was still. The display cases were dark and empty and clean. Wren closed her eyes and let the building breathe around her and thought for just a moment about the $920 and the deed in its plastic sleeve and the way her brother had smiled when he placed the keys in her hand, and she let those thoughts move through her without grabbing at them. Then she thought about tomorrow, about fire, about the patience a thing requires before it will give you what you came for. She slept. The fire, Clement told her, was not a thing you learned. It was a thing you earned. He said it on the first morning standing at the mouth of the brick oven with his cane hooked over the edge of the work table and his sleeves already rolled, watching her arrange the kindling the way he had shown her the afternoon before. Small and dry at the center. Then larger pieces built around it with air between them, not packed tight, not careless, but structured. The way a good argument is structured, each piece supporting the next. Nothing wasted. "You're rushing it," he said, and she hadn't thought she was. "I'm just trying to get it right." "Rushing and getting it right are not opposites," he said. "You can rush a thing and get it right. The oven will still know. It will hold the impatience in the walls and give it back to you in the bread." She looked at the structure of wood she had built and tried to see what he saw. She pulled one piece out and repositioned it. Then another. Clement watched without comment. She lit it from beneath the way he had shown her and crouched back on her heels and watched the flame catch and travel, and she left the iron door cracked just the way he had said. Not wide, not shut, that fraction that created the draw without smothering what was trying to breathe. The smoke that came was thin and pale and fast. Good Clement said, which was the closest he came to praise in those early days. He lowered himself onto a stool with a sound like something old and well-used settling into a familiar position, and he told her to sit and watch the fire for 2 hours. Just watch it. Do nothing else. She was restless by the 40-minute mark. She shifted on her stool and caught herself reaching for something to do and made herself put her hands back in her lap. Boring, Clement said without looking up from the middle distance he seemed to be examining. Yes, she said. Bread is mostly boring, he said. People think it's the warm smell and the pretty loaves. It isn't. It's the waiting. It's doing the small correct thing 10,000 times, and most of the 10,000 times, nothing interesting is happening. He poked the fire through the cracked door with a long iron tool. Your mother understood that. She didn't like it any better than you do, but she understood it. Understanding something and liking it are different things. He was quiet for a moment. Question is whether she gave you the patience or whether you're going to have to grow it yourself. Wren watched the fire and didn't answer because she didn't know the answer yet. The first batch was a disaster. The oven ran too hot because she had fed it too much in the second hour, wanting more from it than it was ready to give. And the loaves came out black on the bottom and raw in the middle. The worst possible combination, neither done nor salvageable. She stood looking at them on the peel and felt the failure move through her like weather. She did not cry. She put the ruined loaves in the bin and cleaned the peel and started again. The second batch came out pale and dense. The oven had cooled further than she realized while she was preparing the dough, and she hadn't accounted for the recovery time. The bread was edible technically, but it had no life in it. It lay on the cooling rack looking defeated. Clement ate a piece of the second batch, chewing slowly and thoughtfully the way a person chews when they are deciding something. What do you taste, he said. She tried a piece. Cold now and heavy. A mistake, she said. Which mistake? She thought about it honestly. I didn't trust the oven. I thought I knew where it was and I didn't check. He nodded once. That's the one that costs the most, he said, assuming you know where something is when you haven't looked. He set down the rest of his piece. Try again. The third batch she rushed the proof because she was tired and her back ached from crouching, and she convinced herself in the way that exhausted people convince themselves of things that it was close enough. It wasn't. The loaves came out dense as clay, no spring, no crumb, the yeast having given up somewhere in the process, because she hadn't given it the time it needed to finish its work. Clement ate a piece of that one too. Now you know what impatience tastes like, he said. Remember it. You can't aim for right if you've never met wrong. The fourth batch she overcorrected, extending the proof so long the dough collapsed on itself, exhausted, the structure gone. She stood at the rack and looked at the flat, sorry things and almost laughed because at some point failure becomes its own education, and you can either fight it or learn it. She learned it. It took most of a week. Dot came each evening with food and let Wren wash up in the apartment above the flower shop, and Rue slept across the bakery's back door each night like something self-appointed. The neighborhood was quiet around the dark shop, the two streets crossing in the cold, the laundromat running its cycles, the hardware store opening and closing each day, and inside, in the back room lit by that single yellow bulb. Wren and an old man in a brick oven worked through the education that cannot be found in any book, because the book cannot tell you what the heat feels like on the back of your hand at the right moment, cannot tell you what the smoke smells like when the wood is exactly what the fire wants, cannot give you the quality of silence that approved loaf has when it is ready, a fullness in the air around it that you recognize only after you have missed it enough times to know what it isn't. On the sixth morning, Wren loaded 4 loaves of her mother's sweetbread onto the long wooden peel and slid them into the brick oven and shut the iron door and stood back. Clement sat on his stool and said nothing. She watched the clock on the wall, the old round-faced one her mother had hung there 30 years ago and never replaced because it had never been wrong. She resisted the urge to open the door and check. She had checked too early twice before and lost heat she couldn't easily get back. She waited. She counted her own breaths, and when she ran out of patience, she counted them again. When the timer she had set went off, she opened the iron door. The loaves were golden, high and rounded the crusts, the brown that her mother had always called honest. Nothing pale, nothing burnt, just the color of something that had been given enough time and enough heat in exactly the right proportions. She slid the peel under them one at a time and brought them out and set them on the cooling rack and stood back. Clement came off his stool. He moved to the rack and stood looking at the loaves for a moment. Then he picked up the nearest one and turned it over in his hands and knocked the bottom of it once with his knuckle. The sound it made was hollow and clean. He broke the end off, the corner the piece she had always stolen as a child. He put it in his mouth and chewed, and his jaw worked slowly, and his eyes went wet in the way that very old men's eyes go wet when something reaches them that they weren't prepared for. "There she is," he said, and his voice was not quite steady. He said it to no one and to everyone. "There she is." He would not take money. When she tried, he waved his cane at her with the genuine offense of a man whose dignity has been questioned, and she stopped trying. "Your mother fed this block for 30 years, he said. "She fed me the winter my wife was in the hospital, and I couldn't think straight enough to boil water. You open the door. Now watch how fast a neighborhood remembers who kept it warm." He was right. She didn't know yet how right. It was Dot who found the ledger. She was clearing the office of 30 years of accumulated paperwork to make room for Wren to actually use the desk. And she came to the doorway holding a fat book bound in cracked black cloth, the kind that old-fashioned grocers used, and her face was doing something complicated that Wren didn't have a word for. She handed it across without speaking. Wren opened it at the work table under the overhead light, and her first feeling before she had read a single line was a sudden breathless hope, because she was 19 years old and had $51 at the start of this week. And here was a book that looked exactly like a record of debts, owed names and amounts in her mother's careful printing, and for one shameful second she thought about collecting. Then she read the first entry. The Ferreira family. New baby born early. 2 weeks of bread and soup for the house. And beside the amount, a single line drawn through it in her mother's pen and 3 words paid in full. She turned the page. A man's name she half recognized, a former neighbor out of work during a difficult stretch at the mill that had laid off half the neighborhood over one bad winter. 1 loaf daily. Tell him it's the day old. Do not let him pay. 11 months of entries. A line through all of it. Paid in full. Another name. A young couple new to the street, a sick infant, a mother too exhausted to cook. Soup and bread delivered Sundays for 4 months. Paid in full. She turned pages. She kept turning pages. The widow 3 doors down, who had received a fresh loaf every Friday for the last decade of her life, and who it turned out had never been asked for a cent, because May had simply told her it was whatever was left at the end of the week. The paper boy who left every morning with a custard tart in his jacket pocket that he apparently believed he was getting away with. The entire day shift at a machine shop 2 blocks over during the winter, the ownership cut hours without warning, fed at May's counter, so they would have somewhere warm to wait out the afternoon without it costing them what little dignity the situation had left them. Page after page after page. 30 years of names, 30 years of small generosities, each one written down as carefully as any debt, each one crossed out with the same 3 words in the same steady hand. Paid in full, paid in full, paid in full. She kept the books on her own kindness, Wren said. Her voice didn't work quite right. Not so anyone would pay her back, Dot said quietly from where she stood in the office doorway. Just so she'd remember she did it. She had a saying I used to argue with her about because I thought it was foolish. She'd say, Dot, the ledger always balances. It just doesn't always balance in money. She paused. I told her she was being impractical. I've been thinking about that conversation for 9 years now, and I'm only starting to understand that she was the smarter one at that table. Wren closed the ledger and held it against her chest and sat with it for a while. Then she stood up and went back to the oven because Clement was right that talking was for people who weren't going to do the thing. Word moved through the Allegheny neighborhood the way word always moves through a place where people have known each other long enough to share a common memory. Dot told her customers. Clement told the men at the club he went to on Tuesday evenings where old men played cards and pretended the real purpose was the cards. The men told their wives, the wives told each other. And within the week, people Wren half remembered from childhood and people she had never met were knocking on the back door. Not to buy anything because there was nothing to buy yet, to help. The man from the hardware store 2 blocks over came on a Thursday morning and spent 40 minutes with the deck oven and a particular wrench that seemed to be having a conversation with the fitting behind the pilot. And when he stood up, the burner lit on the first try clean and blue. He refused anything for it. May had carried his store on credit for an entire year when the big box opened on the highway and nobody was sure he was going to survive it. He said he'd been waiting for a way to make it even and this was close enough. 2 women from a church 3 streets over that Wren didn't attend showed up on a Saturday with buckets and industrial cleaner and spent most of the day on their knees on the front room floor. And when they stood up, the old tile showed its original pattern for the first time in years. Small cream and brown squares in a simple design that her mother had once told her she had chosen because it looked like it would last, which it had. A man who painted signs and murals spent a Saturday on a ladder outside, and when he climbed down and stepped back onto the sidewalk and looked up the window, said Mays again in fresh gold letters. And beside the name because Wren had asked him for it, and he had said, of course, without asking why, a single yellow pair. People brought things. A stand mixer that worked where the old one had given out. 50-pound sacks of flour and sugar that appeared on the back step before dawn, left by people who didn't want to make a thing of it. A stack of mismatched chairs that were somehow exactly right. A cash register from a shop that had closed, and whose owner said he'd rather it go to May's girl than to a liquidator. An old man Wren didn't know pressed $200 into her hand one morning and was out the door before she could respond. And Dot, who had seen it happen, said his wife had cleaned the church with May every Saturday for 15 years, and not to chase him that it would hurt him worse to take it back than it had cost him to give it. Wren watched all of this and felt something she didn't entirely have a word for. Something between gratitude and humility, and a third thing that had no clean name. She had understood the ledger in her head, the record of her mother's 30 years of quiet generosity. But understanding a thing and feeling it land are different. She was 19 years old and had been handed what her brothers had called a money pit and a joke. And the neighborhood was filling it back up with everything her mother had put into it. Not as repayment, but as continuation, the natural movement of something that had always been meant to keep going. She did not watch passively. She organized what she could and made decisions about what she could reach. She studied the layout of the front room and moved 2 things and found it better. She priced the bread by checking what other bakeries in Pittsburgh were charging and setting her prices slightly below, not from lack of confidence, but because her mother's customers were not wealthy people and never had been. And a bakery that priced itself out of reach of its own neighborhood had misunderstood its own purpose. She drafted a simple opening announcement on a piece of brown paper and taped it inside the front window, handwritten in block letters the way her mother would have done. She was not waiting for permission. She had stopped waiting for permission somewhere in the second week, somewhere between the second failed batch and the third, somewhere in the hours of sitting with the fire and learning to read what it needed. The decision to open was hers. The timing was hers. The bakery was hers, and she had the deed in its plastic sleeve in the green folder to prove it. And she had paid the $920 in back taxes herself in cash. Walking into the county office on a Thursday morning with the money she had borrowed from Dot against the first week's earnings, and she had taken the receipt and walked back to the bakery and opened the green folder and placed the receipt inside it and closed the folder and put it back in the cabinet. And that had been the first thing she had done entirely on her own with no one watching and no one to confirm she had done it correctly. The receipt was in the folder. The folder was in the cabinet. The building was hers. On a Tuesday morning in the second week of December, 6 weeks after the Friday night, she had walked through the back door with Rue at her heel and $51, and the hollow feeling of a person who has been handed nothing and told it was everything. Wren Calloway baked a full run in both ovens. Sweet bread in the brick oven, morning rolls, and custard tarts in the deck oven that now lit on the first try every time. She filled the cases and stood behind the counter in her mother's apron, which was too long on her by 4 inches and tied twice at the back. And at 8 in the morning, she walked to the front door and turned the lock and flipped the sign to open. There was a line. It started at the door and went down the cold sidewalk to the corner, and partway around it, people standing in the December cold, with their collars up and their breath making small clouds stamping their feet, some of them talking to each other, and some of them just waiting in the patient way of people who have decided something is worth waiting for. She stood in the doorway for a moment looking at them, and the brass bell over her head rang once in the cold air from the movement of the door. An old woman near the front of the line took the sweetbread Wren handed her and tore the end off right there on the sidewalk and took a bite and stood still for a moment with her eyes closed. Then she pressed her free hand to her mouth and said, "That's her bread. That's exactly her bread. Oh God, that's May's bread." Wren stood behind the counter and rang up sales and bagged loaves and answered questions, and tried not to think too much about the old woman's face, because if she thought about it too much, she would have to stop, and she couldn't stop because there were 20 people in line, and the custard tarts were going fast, and Dot was working the register beside her, and Clement was on his stool by the brick oven in the back complaining loudly about the temperature differential, as though anyone had asked him. They sold out before 10. 7 days in a row they sold out before 10. She used the money from the first day to pay Dot back. She used the money from the second day to order supplies for the rest of the week. By the fifth day, she was beginning to see the shape of something, a thing that was not yet stable but was no longer impossible, a business that was breathing on its own, tentatively, the way new things breathe when they are trying to decide whether to survive. It was on a Thursday, the last day of December, that Garrison Aldridge came in. He was somewhere in his mid-50s with silver at his temples, and a suit that fit him the way expensive suits fit men who have worn them long enough to stop thinking about them. He was not flashy. He was the kind of polish that has moved past wanting to be noticed and arrived somewhere quieter and more confident. He ordered a loaf of sweet bread and a custard tart and ate the tart standing at the counter with evident and unperformed pleasure. "Best thing I've had in a long time," he said, and it had the quality of a true statement rather than a compliment, which was a distinction Wren had learned early at this counter. He set a business card on the counter and slid it toward her with one finger. "I represent a development group," he said. "I'm not going to insult you with a sales pitch. You've built something real here, and I have enough respect for that to be straightforward." He nodded toward the card. "The corner you're standing on is worth considerably more to my clients than it is to anyone whose primary interest is selling bread. I'm authorized to make an offer that would change your situation significantly. Take your time. Talk to people you trust. The number is on the back." He thanked her, picked up the loaf he had paid for, and left the brass bell marking his exit with its ordinary small sound. Wren turned the card over. She read the number on the back. She read it again because the first reading felt like her eyes had skipped a digit, and the second reading confirmed they hadn't. She put one hand flat on the cool glass of the display case because her legs had done something uncertain. It was more money than her mother had made in her entire working life. It was more money than Wren had ever let herself imagine existing in a form that might touch her. It was enough for culinary school, which the acceptance letter for was still in the bottom of her duffel bag, still addressed to a future that had quietly stopped existing. It was enough for a home, enough to never sleep on a floor again. Enough to stop the low-grade animal fear that had been running underneath everything since the night she had counted $51 in her head and made herself stop before the counting became a real thing. She was still standing there with the card in her hand when the brass bell rang and a shadow crossed the threshold. The warmth went out of the room. She knew the car double-parked at the curb before she registered the face. She had known that car since childhood, the way it sat on the street, the color of the quiet, expensive engine. Beckett came through the door of May's Bakery in his good coat and looked around at the full display cases and the customers at the small tables Wren had arranged along the window, and the gold pair on the glass, and Dot at the register, and he spread his arms open in an expansive gesture. "Wren, look at this place. Look what you did." His voice was warm. Genuinely warm, she thought, Or perhaps the kind of warmth that is manufactured so completely it has become indistinguishable from the real thing. She stayed behind the counter. He helped himself to a custard tart from the open display, ate it with his elbows on the case, made an appreciative sound. The room had gone quieter, the small hush of a space that senses something arriving. "Can we talk in the back?" he said. "Family stuff." "You can say it here," Wren said. Dot set down the bag she was filling and folded her arms. Something moved in Brackett's face, brief and controlled. "Okay, sure." He lowered his voice anyway, not quite enough to exclude the room. "I'm not going to pretend I came to say hello. I know about the development offer." He watched her face as he said it, and she understood with a clarity that felt almost physical that he had known about the offer before he walked through the door. Probably before she had the card in her hand. He had sources she didn't, people watching this corner with professional attention. "I've been making calls," he said, "after I saw the write-up in the local paper. And I learned some things I genuinely wish I'd known when we were sorting out the estate. Like the fact that this building is clean. Paid off." He shook his head with the practiced wonder of a man encountering a surprise he prepared for. "I didn't know that, Wren. Mom kept her cards close. I thought it was mortgaged to the roof. I thought I was handing you a problem. And here it turns out to be the only asset in the estate that matters." She said nothing. He pressed on. "Here's what's fair. We sell to the developer. We split 3 ways. You, me, Hadley even. The way Mom would have wanted. You walk away with more than you'd clear selling bread for 20 years. You go to that culinary school. You open a new bakery somewhere better. Everyone gets something." He paused and his voice dropped a degree. "Or we could make this complicated. Estates get reopened all the time. Lawyers ask questions about influence, about who was in the room with an elderly woman in her final months, about the circumstances under which documents get signed." He said it gently, the way you say something you regret having to say. "It would be a shame. At your age with this nice thing you've built." He let it sit. "Or we do the smart thing. Like family." He set his own card on the counter, smiled at Dot. Dot did not smile back. He walked to the door and the bell rang behind him, bright and ordinary, the same bell that had rung for 30 years above the door of a place that had never belonged to him and would not now. Wren realized she was shaking only when Dot carefully took the developer's card from her hand where it had been clenched without her noticing and smoothed it on the counter. Dot did not say anything immediately. She just set the card flat and smoothed it once, and then picked up the bag she had set down and finished filling it. Wren took a breath. Then she went to the back room and put her hands on the work table and looked at the brick oven and let her breathing return to something ordinary. He came in here, she thought. He came into her mother's bakery and ate her mother's tart and threatened to open her mother's estate and question her mother's mind at the end of her life. And he did it gently, as though the gentleness changed what it was. She stayed at the work table for 3 minutes. Then she went back to the front and finished out the day. Hadley came that night. She heard the back door after close when the ovens were cooling and the cases were wiped and the shop was dark except for the light over the work table. She thought it was Dot, but the knock was different. Quieter, less certain. 3 knocks and then a long pause as though the person on the other side was reconsidering. She opened the door. Hadley stood on the back step with his hands jammed into his coat pockets and the look of a man who has not slept in several days and has stopped trying to hide it. He was thinner than she remembered, which had only been weeks, and his eyes had the quality of someone who has been spending a lot of time alone with something he can't resolve. "Brackett doesn't know I'm here," he said. She stepped back and let him in. Rue lifted his head, decided Hadley wasn't a threat or a friend, and put his head back down. Hadley stood in the middle of the back room and looked at the clean ovens and the risen loaves on the racks under their cloths, and his face came apart in small pieces, and he put it back together with visible effort. "There wasn't really any debt, Wren," he said. "Not the way we told you. The floor did something." She put her hand on the edge of the work table. "The insurance covered most of the medical," he said, speaking quickly. "Now the way a person speaks when they've decided to do a thing and are moving before they can stop themselves. After everything, after all the bills, after the house sold, and all of it was settled, there was money. A lot of money. He reached into his coat and put an envelope on the table, setting it down with both hands, a careful, deliberate placement. The house sold for $240,000, he said. The life insurance policy was another 50. The actual unpaid bills came to maybe 28,000 all told. That left 160,000 roughly after everything was cleared. Wren did not speak. We split it, Hadley said. Me and Breckett. We split it, and we told you there was nothing. Your share was at least $80,000, Wren. At least. We took it. I took it. He had stopped looking at her. He was looking at the envelope on the table. I told myself Breckett was handling it. I told myself you were 19 and we'd give you some later when things were better. I told myself a lot of things across a lot of nights, and every one of them was a reason I built around wanting to keep what was right there in front of me. He exhaled slowly. That's 41,000 in there. My half of what we took. It's all of it. I've been carrying it around for a week trying to find the nerve to bring it. He stepped back from the envelope one step as though removing himself from the transaction. Whatever Breckett is planning with the developer, I want no part of it. I won't sign anything. If it goes to lawyers, I'll tell the truth. All of it. Even the parts that could make trouble for me. I should have told the truth at that kitchen table. I'll be telling myself that until I die. He looked at her then, finally. His eyes were red and there was no dignity in it, and he didn't try to manufacture any. Why now, Wren said. It was the only question she had. Because I drove past today, he said. There was a line out the door to the corner, and I sat in my car across the street and watched people walking out with bread, and I thought about what we did to the only one of us who actually stayed. He stopped. The only one of us who was actually there at the end, who held her hand, who was in the room. He pulled his coat back on. I'm not asking you to forgive me, he said. I know that's not what this is. He went out the back door and pulled it shut behind him, and she heard his footsteps on the cold concrete going away. For a long time after the door closed, Wren stood at the work table with the envelope of money in front of her, and Rue breathing against her foot, and the smell of cooling bread in the dark. She did not touch the envelope. She looked at it. She thought about what it represented and what it didn't. Then she picked it up and carried it to the front of the shop and put it in the cash drawer beneath the register under the tray out of sight. She understood with a certainty she couldn't entirely explain yet that the money in that envelope was not hers to spend for herself. It belonged to something else, something she could see the shape of, but not yet the full form. The room upstairs was empty. The roof had soft spots she had noticed when the rain came last week. And somewhere in Pittsburgh, she thought somebody was sleeping in a car. She would know what to do with it. She just didn't know yet the exact shape of the knowing. She went back to the brick oven and banked the coals the way Clement had taught her, covering them carefully so the heat would be waiting in the morning alive and ready, not wasted and not gone. Then she went to her cot, the one Dot had carried over from the apartment above the flower shop 3 weeks ago, and set up in the corner and covered with a proper quilt in a pillow that smelled like lavender in someone else's home. She lay down and Rue settled against her feet, and the building settled around them both in the winter dark. Outside, the two streets crossed in the cold. The gold pair on the front window caught the light from the street lamp and held it. The display cases were empty and clean, wiped down at the end of the day, the way her mother had done it, as though she were only closing for the night and would be back in the morning, which Wren thought was more or less the truth. She closed her eyes and let the warmth of the banked coals move through the walls, and she slept, and she did not dream. And in the morning the fire would be waiting exactly where she had left it. She opened the letter on a Sunday night in the middle of January, when the shop had been closed for 3 hours, and the street outside was empty, and the only sound was Rue breathing against her foot, and the occasional tick of the brick oven cooling in the back room. She had known she was ready the same way she knew the bread was ready, not by the clock, but by something that has no name, but is reliable if you have learned to trust it. She had waited 7 weeks. She had slept on the floor and learned to feed a fire, and failed 4 times at something her mother had done every morning for 30 years and then succeeded. And she had opened the door and watched a neighborhood come back to a corner. It had been grieving, and she had stood behind her mother's counter and listened to Beckett threaten her in a low voice while eating her mother's tart, and she had taken Hadley's envelope and put it in the drawer and left it there. She had done all of that, and now she was ready. She took the envelope from where it leaned against the tin painted with the yellow pear, and she sat on the stool at the work table, and she slid her thumb under the flap, and it gave without resistance, as though it had been waiting for exactly this pressure and no other. 2 pages. Her mother's handwriting, smaller than usual, packed close every line used the way May wrote, when she had a great deal to say and was being careful about the space. My Wren. If you are reading this, then you came back to the shop, and that tells me everything I needed to know about which of my children I could trust with the only thing that was ever really mine. She had to stop and breathe before she could go on. The letter said, I have known for some time that your brothers would do what frightened, small-hearted people do when a person they love dies and leaves something behind. They will count, they will divide, they will take. I watch them become men who measure everything against everything else and are never satisfied with what the measuring shows them, and I prayed I was wrong about them, and I do not think I was wrong. I could not stop them from taking the money. If I had divided everything equally while I was still well enough to do it, they would have found a way to dispute it, to drag you through lawyers and years and the ugliness that money brings out of people who have decided they deserve more than they have. So I am going to let them have the money. All of it. The house, the savings, the insurance, the things that shine. Let them take what shines. They will be satisfied for a little while, and then the money will be gone, because that kind of money in those kinds of hands is always gone. I have watched it happen enough times in enough families to know the shape of it. But this building I bought with my own hands and paid off with my own hands and put in your name alone, clean, where no one can reach it. I put it in your name, and I let your brothers believe it was a burden, a liability, a thing they were generously sparing themselves by letting you keep it. I disguised the most valuable thing I had as something no one would want. They will hand you a dead corner and think they have cheated you. My darling girl, it is the whole of me. Every recipe in the tin. Every person on this block who ever walked through that door with nothing and left a little fuller. The ovens are good for another lifetime if you feed them right and do not rush them, which you will try to do because you have always rushed the custard. Don't. They will take what shines. You take what lasts. I left them the money. I left you me. The handwriting changed in the last section, less controlled, the letters larger, and less even the hand of someone writing with effort. I am sorry if getting here cost you more than I planned. I hope they would at least be decent to you in the getting of it. If they were not, then you already know what I am trying to give you, which is, this family is not who shares your blood. It is who shares your bread. Open the door, Wren. Feed people. The ledger always balances. I love you. I love you. Light the oven. There was a postscript at the very bottom in the smallest writing on the page, as though it had been added later when the hand was less steady and the time was shorter. In the envelope with this letter, you will find a name and a number. Clarence Whitmore, attorney. He knows everything. He has been holding something for me. Call him when you are ready. Wren read the letter 3 times. Somewhere in the third reading, the grief and the anger and the fear, all of it, that had been living in her chest since the Tuesday morning of the funeral, and the Thursday of the signing table, and the Friday of the $51, all of it loosened at once, not disappearing, but releasing its grip, and what was left underneath was something so plain and so simple that it almost made her laugh. Her mother had seen it coming, every piece of it, and she had loved her daughter not with the love that hopes for the best from people, but with the love that plans around the worst and leaves the good things standing anyway. She looked in the envelope and found the small folded card with Clarence Whitmore's name and number written in her mother's hand, and she set it on the work table beside the letter and looked at both of them for a while. Then she picked up the black ledger from the shelf where she had put it after Dot found it, and she opened it to the front and took the letter and pressed it flat, and laid it against the inside cover, and she closed the ledger over it. The letter belonged at the beginning. It was the opening page of everything. She called Clarence Whitmore the next morning, Monday, before the first bake. He answered on the second ring, an older man's voice, deliberate and unhurried. The voice of someone who charges by the hour and has learned that patience is a professional asset. He said he had been expecting her call. He said May had prepared him thoroughly. She had, it turned out, prepared him very thoroughly. The affidavit had been drawn up 8 months before May died, when she was still well enough to sit in a lawyer's office for 2 hours and answer questions in front of a notary. It stated with the specificity of a woman who knew exactly what she was doing and intended to make that clear to any future reader that the building at the corner of Allegheny had been transferred to Wren Calloway's name freely, without inducement or pressure, by a woman of sound mind who had consulted independent counsel and was not under the influence of any person or substance. It stated the full picture of the estate's assets as May understood them at the time of signing. It named Beckett Calloway and Hadley Calloway by name, and described in plain language the pattern of behavior May had observed over the years that had led her to make the arrangements she had made. Clarence Whitmore would provide this document along with supporting materials to any court that asked for them. Wren sat at the work table with the phone against her ear and listened to all of this, and then she thanked Clarence Whitmore and told him she would call again if she needed him. She understood as she set down the phone that Beckett's threat had always been hollow. He had put the building in her name himself to be rid of it, and he had done it cleanly through the same legal process he had relied on for everything else. He had no claim. He had hidden money from a 19-year-old girl, and his own brother was prepared to say so in sworn testimony. A man that exposed does not go to court. He performs the threat, and then he goes quiet and hopes the other person does too. Wren was not going to be quiet, but she was also not going to wait for him to come to her again. She called Beckett that afternoon. She made her voice ordinary and her request simple. She told him she'd been thinking about what he'd said and that she thought they should talk properly, the two of them, at the bakery at 10 in the morning 2 days from now. She said she would have coffee. He agreed. She could hear the satisfaction in his voice, the settling of a man who has been waiting for a capitulation and believes he can hear it coming. She spent the time between the call and the meeting doing what she had been doing every day. She baked, she opened the door, she served the line. She watched Clement on his stool and Dot at the register, and Rue in his patch of winter sun by the window, where 2 customers had already independently left dog biscuits on the sill without being asked. She wiped down the cases at the end of each day, and she banked the coals, and she went to sleep, and she did not spend more time than necessary thinking about what was coming, because she had decided it wasn't worth the sleep. On the morning of this meeting, she put out coffee in 2 cups, which was more hospitality than the occasion required, but was the kind of thing her mother would have done. She set the deed out on the work table. She set the affidavit beside it, the copy Clarence Whitmore had mailed express, which had arrived the day before. She set a single handwritten note with Hadley's statement of what he would testify to if called. Dot was in the front room. Clement was on his stool. Neither of them had been asked to stay. They had simply not left when closing time came the previous evening, and they were still there in the morning, and Wren had not said anything about it because there was nothing to say. Beckett arrived 3 minutes early, which told her something about how confident he was feeling. He came in the front and looked around at the bakery in its morning light, the cases full, the gold pair on the window, Rue asleep in the sun, and something moved across his face that might have been in someone with a slightly different history close to pride. He came through to the back room and saw the work table and the papers on it, and the 2 cups of coffee, and some of his ease left him not all of it, but enough to register. Wren did not say good morning. She said, "Sit down, Beckett," and she waited until he did. Then she walked him through the papers. Not quickly, not with drama, just clearly, the way Clement had taught her to tend the fire, with attention to the thing itself and no wasted motion. The deed, the affidavit, what Hadley had told her and what Hadley was prepared to repeat in other settings. The estate figures as Hadley had given them, the insurance, the sale price, the actual bills, the money that had been divided without her. Beckett sat through all of it. He drank his coffee. His face went through several configurations and settled finally into something flat and controlled the face of a man who has run out of good hands and is deciding what to do about it. She had expected anger. She had prepared for it quietly, the way you prepare for weather you can read coming. What came instead was worse in the way that smaller and truer things are sometimes worse than large dramatic ones. His shoulders dropped. Not all at once, but incrementally, like a building that has been losing structural integrity for years and has finally reached the point where the drop is visible. He was still wearing the good coat, but she could see now what she had not been able to see through the performance of his confidence. The coat was not this season's coat, it was last year's or the year before, maintained, carefully pressed and brushed, but telling its own story to anyone who knew how to look. "My business is gone," he said. His voice had changed. The salesman's register was still there, barely the way a habit persists after its usefulness has ended. "It's been gone for 8 months. I owe people who don't wait politely and don't care about circumstances. The money we took from the estate," he paused and she noticed he said "we," that small habitual deflection. "The money bought me about 4 months of pretending it hadn't happened. Then it was gone." He looked at the papers on the table. "I came here thinking I could pressure you into a sale and take a third of something that would have cleared what I owe and given me a little room." He said it without attempting to dress it up, which was the first honest thing she had heard from him since the kitchen table in November. "I thought you'd fold. You're 19. He almost said something else and then didn't. She looked at her brother across her mother's work table, and she saw what was actually there, which was not the broad-shouldered man with the easy face and the labeled folders, but a frightened man in a coat that was beginning to show its age. A man who had spent his whole life counting what other people had and comparing it to what he had, and never once arriving at enough, and who had finally run the calculation all the way down to zero. She thought about the letter, what her mother had said about him, the money that runs out because that kind of money in those kinds of hands always runs out. She thought about something else too, the thing she had not let herself examine too directly because it was painful in a way that didn't resolve cleanly into anger. Her mother had loved the bakery and the late-born daughter who had grown up inside it with a fullness and a specificity that her sons who had grown up and left before the bakery was everything had not received in quite the same form. She did not think her mother had loved them less. She thought her mother had loved them differently and at a distance, and that the distance had done damage nobody had talked about, and that some portion of what Beckett had become was the shape that damage had taken in him over 30 years. This did not excuse a single thing he had done, but she could see it, and seeing it changed something in the room, not everything, but something. "Keep it," she said. He looked up. "The 80,000. Keep it. Pay what you owe. I'm not going to chase you for it." She let that sit for a moment, and then she said clearly, so there was no ambiguity, "And don't come back here with a developer or with lawyers or with anything else. There is no version of this where you get this building. Mom decided that before she died, and she was thorough about it, and Clarence Whitmore has everything he needs. That's finished." He opened his mouth. "It's finished," she said again, and her voice was her mother's voice. She could hear it, the tone May had used when a thing was decided, and repeating yourself was an insult to everyone in the room. Beckett closed his mouth. He sat for another moment with the papers in front of him that dismantled everything he had built in his head, and then he stood and he buttoned his coat, and he looked around the back room of the bakery one more time at the brick oven and the clean work table and the proofing cloths draped over tomorrow's risen dough. And his face did something she had never seen it do before. It went entirely unguarded just for a second. And what was underneath was not anger and not calculation, but something much older and much quieter. The face of a boy who had left too early and come back too late and could not find the door back to the thing he had missed. Then it was gone, and he was buttoned up again, and he nodded at her once. A small nod, and he walked through the front room past Dot, who did not look up from what she was doing, and past Clement, who looked up very deliberately and held Beckett's gaze just long enough to be clear about it, and out the front door, and the brass bell rang behind him, ordinary and final. Wren stood at the work table and breathed until her hands were steady. Then she gathered the papers and put them back in the green folder, and put the green folder in the cabinet, and closed the drawer. Garrison Aldridge came back on a morning in early February, polite as always, a man who understood that a no given with time and consideration was a different category of no than one given in haste. He ordered coffee and a morning roll, and he sat at one of the small tables by the window for a while before he came to the counter. "I'm here for your answer," he said, "whatever it is." Wren reached under the counter and brought up a loaf of sweet bread, the best one from the morning's run, still faintly warm, and she set it on the counter and slid it toward him. "The answer is no," she said. "Thank you for the offer. I mean that. But this corner isn't mine to sell." She paused, finding the right words. "It belongs to the people who walk through that door. It has for 30 years. They need it more than I need the number on that card." He looked at her for a moment the way people look at you when they are deciding whether you mean what you just said. Then he smiled. A real one, not the professional warmth of a man closing a meeting, but the genuine article, a man encountering something he hadn't expected. "Your mother," he said, "must have been a genuinely hard woman to do business with." "She was," Wren said. "She really was." He paid for the loaf she had given him, left the change in the tip jar on the counter, and walked out into the February cold. She watched him go and felt something settle in her that had been waiting to settle since the Thursday in December when she had first turned his card over and read the number, and felt the floor go uncertain under her feet. The development went up that spring, a block away, glass and clean angles. The kind of building that turns its back on the street it's built beside. May sat in front of it like a small, stubborn fact, the old brick and the gold pair on the window, and the line that started forming before 7 most mornings, and people seemed to love it more for the contrast, or maybe the contrast had nothing to do with it, and they would have come anyway because they had always come, because the corner had always been the corner. Petra arrived at the end of March. Wren was doing the second bake of the morning when the front bell rang, and Dot, who had been restocking the display, went quiet, in the way she went quiet when something required attention. The girl in the doorway was slight for her age, with the look of someone the years had not quite caught up to yet. She was in a coat too thin for Pittsburgh in March, which was still more winter than spring, regardless of what the calendar said. She had a backpack that held the compressed weight of everything a person owns when everything a person owns fits in a backpack. She stood just inside the door with her chin up and her eyes going first to the exits and then to the cases, and then to Wren behind the counter, and she had already composed her face into the expression of someone who is prepared to be told to leave. "I don't have any money," the girl said, and she said it quickly, the way you say a thing you want to get in front of before someone else can use it against you. "I'll go. I just wanted to be warm for a minute." "I'm sorry." "Sit down," Wren said. "You're letting the cold in." Something crossed the girl's face. Not relief yet, because she had learned to be careful with relief, but the precursor to it, the small, cautious opening of a door that has been shut a long time. She sat at the table nearest the radiator. Wren put a custard tart and a cup of milky sweet coffee in front of her and said nothing and went back to the bake. Dot refilled the coffee without being asked. Clement on his stool pretended with great concentration to be interested in the temperature gauge on the brick oven. The girl ate. She had 2 cups of coffee and ate the tart and a morning roll that Dot put down beside the plate without commentary, and she ate with the focused attention of someone for whom food has not been a casual thing for a while. Her name was Petra. She told Wren this after the second cup of coffee, along with the shape of the situation in the flat, even tone of a person who has told their own story enough times to have stopped expecting it to produce anything. She had aged out of foster care in February. 18 on paper, which was what mattered to the placement office that needed the bed for someone younger, though she carried it the way some people carry their age, as if the number and the person wearing it haven't entirely agreed with each other yet. She had been sleeping in the back seat of a friend's older brother's car since the temperature dropped, which the friend's older brother had been generous about and which Petra was clear-eyed enough to understand had a limited shelf life. Wren listened. She did not ask questions. She understood in the way you understand things that have happened to your own body, that questions from strangers feel like inventory, like you are being assessed for your own story rather than simply heard inside it. When Petra had finished, Wren leaned on the counter. I need someone who can be here at 4 in the morning, she said. Someone who doesn't mind getting flour in places flour shouldn't go. Someone who can learn to not rush the custard, which is the hardest thing I'll ever teach. She paused. It doesn't pay much yet, but there's a room upstairs with a lock on the door, and it's yours if you want the job. And the room comes with it either way. The room isn't conditional on the job. The room is just because it's March in Pittsburgh and no one should be sleeping in a car. Petra looked at her with the disbelief of a person who has been disappointed so many times by good things that they have stopped expecting good things to be what they appear to be. Why would you do that? She said. You don't know me. Wren thought about all the possible answers. She gave the truest one. Because someone did it for me, she said, and because my mother taught me that the ledger always balances. You'll understand that part later. Petra moved into the room above the bakery that evening. The rooms where May had raised 3 children over the ovens, the rooms Wren had cleaned and furnished simply in the months since reopening a bed and a dresser and a lamp and a table and a door with a good lock. She carried her backpack up the stairs and stood in the doorway for a moment looking at the room with its lamp on and the window looking out over the crossing of the 2 streets. Wren left her to it. That night, after the shop was fully closed and the cases wiped and the coals banked, she used the $41,000 the way she had known she would since the night she put it in the drawer. She did not keep it for herself. The roof first, she decided the soft spots she had been watching since November, and she called the roofer Dot recommended and got an estimate and wrote the check and felt nothing but rightness about it. After the roof, the wiring in the back room that Clement had been pointing at with his cane for 2 months and calling a liability. After the wiring, she opened a small account with the balance and wrote 2 words in her own ledger above the account number, community, ongoing. She went to the shelf behind the register and took down the black ledger. She carried it to the work table and opened it to the front page where she had pressed her mother's letter into the inside cover. She turned past the letter, past the first entries in her mother's hand, the name she had read weeks ago, the 30 years of paid in full. She found the first blank page. She picked up the pen that lived on the work table, the heavy one, with the good barrel that her mother had always preferred for the ledger, and she wrote carefully. Petra, room and training, paid in full. Below that on the next line, roof, building repairs, community fund, paid in full. She set the pen down. She looked at what she had written for a while in the yellow light of the single bulb above the work table. The same bulb that had been burning the first night, the one whose bill her mother had gone on paying after she locked the door, the bill that had kept a light on in a closed bakery for 2 winters, as though something in there were waiting. The ledger was not a record of the past. She understood that now fully in a way she had understood partially since the night she first read it. It was a practice, a verb, not a noun. Her mother had not kept it as a memorial to her own generosity. She had kept it as an act of attention, a way of seeing clearly what she was doing with her days, a way of holding herself accountable to the version of herself she had decided to be. Wren closed the ledger and put it back under the counter where it lived. Hadley found his way back slowly, which was the only way that would have meant anything. He started appearing on Sunday afternoons when the shop was closed, not asking to be let in, but standing at the back door in the posture of a man who has decided to show up and leave the rest to whoever opens the door. She let him in. He brought his hands in his silence, and he washed the week's accumulated pans and restacked the flour sacks and did the small physical work of a place without needing to be directed. The way a person works when they know a space well and are trying to earn back the right to be in it. He didn't ask for forgiveness. She didn't offer it. The word never came up. What came up instead was Sunday after Sunday of shared work in the warm back room, and slowly the way a bruise fades, not in a moment, but in such small daily increments that you can never point to the exact day it stopped hurting, the space between them changed into something bearable. He was good with Petra, which Wren had not expected. He was patient with her questions about the register, and he didn't talk down to her, and when she made errors, he corrected them without theater, which she responded to by making fewer of them. They argued about music on the days when Wren let the radio run in the back, Hadley defending things that had come out before Petra was born, and Petra defending things that Hadley found incomprehensible. And the argument was the same argument every Sunday, and they both seemed to find it preferable to silence. Wren watched this and thought about the strange shapes that healing takes, the ways it doesn't look like what you imagined and is better for that. Beckett came back in December on a morning near the middle of the month, almost exactly a year from the morning she had first turned on the light, and found the single bulb still burning, and the smell of cold flour and old sweetness coming up to meet her. She recognized the sound of the front door before she saw him, the weight of it, the small catch in the frame. She had learned the language of this building the way you learn the sounds of a body you have lived in long enough. He was smaller than she remembered, or her memory of him had scaled him incorrectly, built him up with the fear that had been attached to him. He was wearing a coat she didn't recognize, not the one from before something less expensive and less carefully pressed, the coat of a man who has stopped performing a prosperity he no longer has. His face was quieter, not at peace exactly, but quieter the way a face looks when it has stopped holding something up that was too heavy to hold indefinitely. He stood just inside the door and looked around at the bakery in its morning light. The full cases, the tables where three regulars were already settled with their coffees, the gold pair on the window catching the thin December sun. Dot was at the register, and she looked at him once and then looked at Wren. Wren came out from behind the counter. She did not think about it very much. She went to the rack and she took the best loaf on it, the sweet bread that had come out of the brick oven 40 minutes ago and still held its warmth. And she walked to where her brother was standing and she put it in his hands. "It's cold out," she said. "Take it." He looked down at the bread in his hands. His hands looked like their father's hands, she noticed, which was something she had never noticed before or had forgotten. Large and slightly rough, with the quality of hands that have done physical work. He looked up at her. She had expected to feel something large and definitive. She felt instead something much quieter. The absence of the knot that had lived in her chest since November. The simple fact of her brother standing in her mother's bakery, holding a warm loaf of bread in his father's hands. His eyes filled. He didn't let it go anywhere further than that. He pressed his mouth together and looked at the bread. "Thank you," he said. His voice was hoarse. "You're welcome," she said. She almost left it there. Then she said quietly for him, only the way her mother would have said it. "The door is always open, Beckett. It was never about the money. It never was." He nodded. Once slow, the nod of someone receiving something they are not certain they have earned and are choosing to accept carefully. He didn't say anything else. He went to the door and the brass bell rang, and he stepped out into the December cold with the warm loaf held against his chest, and she watched through the glass as he walked to his car, which was not the car she remembered, and got in and drove away. She didn't know if he would come back. She had made her peace with not knowing. Some doors you leave open because an open door is what you believe in, not because you're certain of who will walk through it. That evening, after everything was closed and the cases clean and the coals banked, and Petra's light on in the window upstairs, and Roos settled at the foot of the cot with his gray muzzle on his front paws, Wren took her coffee and went out the back door to the step. The December air was sharp and clean and very cold. The kind of cold that has no ambition, that is simply what the season is and does not apologize for it. She sat on the back step where it had all started, where she had come around the corner on a Friday night in November with $51 in a duffel bag and the heavy ring of keys her brother had pressed into her palm with a smile, and Rue had come around the side of the building on his careful old legs and leaned his weight against her shins. And the door behind her had opened onto the smell of cold flour and old sweetness that was every good morning of her childhood, and also a room that would never be the same thing again. Rue came out with her now. He was slower on the stairs than he had been even 2 months ago. He navigated the 3 steps with the methodical patience of a creature that has accepted the negotiation. He turned around twice and settled against her leg and put his gray head on her knee and sighed from somewhere deep. He was not waiting anymore. This was not the vigil he had kept through 2 winters at a locked door, the faithful watch of an animal that does not understand absence, but knows that a place where it was fed is a place worth returning to. He was not waiting. He had simply come out to sit with her because she was there, and she was staying, and that was enough. The window above them was warm and gold. Petra's lamp. Wren could hear faintly, if she listened, the sound of the radio, something Petra liked, that drifted down through the old building's floors and into the cold night air. Behind her in the bakery, the brick oven was ticking as it cooled, the sound of a thing that has done its work and is resting, holding its heat for morning. The coals were banked and would be waiting at 4 when she came back in and opened the iron door and gave them air and brought the fire up again. That was the discipline of it. The fire was not gone when the day ended. It was kept. It was maintained. You didn't let it go out entirely, because bringing a cold oven back from nothing cost more than keeping a warm one going. Her mother had understood this about more than ovens. The street in front of the bakery was quiet. The new building, a block over, the glass and steel that had gone up in April and turned its back on the neighborhood it was built beside, had its lights on and the upper floors cold and precise. Here at May's corner, the light from the front window fell on the old sidewalk in a warm rectangle, and the gold pair on the glass held its color even in the dark. In the morning, Clement would arrive at 5, letting himself in with the key she had given him 3 months ago, and he would stand in front of the brick oven and open the iron door and look at the state of the coals, and whatever he found he would manage it, adding wood or adjusting air with the unhurried competence of a man who has been doing this long enough to have nothing left to prove about it. And when she came down at 4:30, he would be on his stool, and there would be coffee already made, and he would not say good morning, because Clement considered good morning a statement of the obvious. Dot would arrive at 7, knocking once on the wall they shared to announce herself, the way she had knocked on that wall every morning for 30 years to announce herself to May. The flower shop would open on one side of the shared wall and the bakery on the other, and the morning would begin its ordinary progression, the line forming outside before the sign was turned, the brass bell ringing, the cases emptying and being filled again. Hadley would come on Sunday. The ledger was under the counter with Petra's name in it now, in Wren's hand. One entry below the last of May's, the same 3 words drawn beneath it, the practice continuing. Below that, the roof, the repairs, the fund, with no formal name. All of it crossed out the same way. All of it the same words. Wren scratched Rue behind his torn ear and felt him lean heavier against her leg, in the way he leaned when something felt right to him. The cold came up through the concrete of the step, and she let it. It was just cold. She had slept on this floor and learned to read fire by the color of its smoke, and failed 4 times at something her mother had done every morning for 30 years, and then done it right, and then done it right again and again, until the rightness of it became ordinary. Became habit, became the simple daily shape of a life built from the inside out. She looked up at the Pittsburgh sky, which was clear tonight. The winter stars very bright, the way they get when the cold has taken everything else out of the air and left only light. She said it quietly to Rue, to her mother, to the cold and the clear sky, and to whoever might be walking 11 blocks right now toward a corner that had a light on. "You're never really poor," she said, while the oven's warm and the doors unlocked. Then she finished her coffee. She stood, and Rue stood with her, and she went inside and closed the back door against the cold, and made her way through the dark bakery to the brick oven, and opened the iron door and looked at the coals, still orange at the center, exactly as she had left them waiting. She made the small adjustments, covered them back, let the door rest nearly closed, that fraction that kept the heat without smothering it. The back step was empty in the dark behind her, the way it can only be empty when no one is left out there waiting alone.